The Galactic Federal Academy sprawled across the small moon of Nexus, like a crown jewel of interstellar diplomacy. Its gleaming spires and transparent dome-shaped lecture halls had become symbols of the Federation's 10,000-cycle commitment to peaceful coexistence. From its central quad, one could see the rich purple atmosphere swirling around the edges of artificial gravity fields, a constant reminder of the delicate balance required to maintain harmony among the hundreds of species that called the Federation home. Inside Lecture Hall, Zeta 9, Professor Marinkal's voice echoed through the chamber as 53 students from 38 species listened with varying degrees of attention. The room's adaptive atmosphere adjusted constantly to accommodate the breathing requirements of beings from gas giants, water worlds, and everything in between. The diplomatic crisis of Cycle 9874 demonstrates precisely why understanding cross-species communication barriers remains our greatest challenge. Professor Cal continued, his forearms gesturing in the elaborate patterns that characterized Vexillian communication. The Harch Confederacy nearly declared war over what they perceived as an insult, when in reality, the Melosian ambassador was merely complimenting their exoskeletal sheen. Soft laughter rippled through the classroom. Most students found these historical anecdotes amusing, safe tales from a distant past when the Federation was young and still working out the complexities of interspecies relations. Professor Cal's upper eyes narrowed slightly as they settled on the quiet human female sitting in the third row. Unlike her classmates, she hadn't laughed. In fact, Alira Voss rarely made any sound at all during class. She simply watched, listened, and occasionally made notes in an antiquated paper journal, a curiosity among students who primarily used neural interfaces or holographic data storage. "Ms. Voss," Professor Cal said, his voice shifting to the more formal register used when addressing humans. "Perhaps you could share your thoughts on how the crisis might have been averted with proper cultural preparation." The classroom fell silent. Alira Voss was known for many things: her exceptional grades, her solitary habits, and above all, her reluctance to speak in class. Some students whispered that it was typical Deathworlder behavior, this tendency to observe silently from the shadows. Others suggested more dramatic theories, that her vocal cords had been damaged during some brutal Earth survival ritual, or that she was actually a Federation intelligence operative placed in the class to monitor potential threats. The truth was much simpler, though no less intriguing. Earth was classified as a death world, a planet with environmental conditions so harsh that most Federation species considered it barely habitable. Gravity, 30% stronger than the galactic standard. Atmospheric oxygen levels that would be toxic to many species. Extreme temperature variations, powerful storms, and abundant predators. Humans who survived and thrived in such conditions were naturally regarded with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and subtle fear by their galactic peers. Alira straightened in her seat. Her dark eyes, nearly black in the ambient lighting, met Professor Cal's four-eyed gaze directly, another Deathworlder trait that many non-humans found disconcerting. The Harch communicate primarily through exoskeletal vibrations and chemical signals, she said, her voice soft but clear. Their translators often miss subtle context cues. A pre-meeting briefing on Harch sensory perception would have prevented the misunderstanding entirely. Professor Cal's secondary arms twitched in approval. "Precisely. Context awareness is fundamental to successful diplomacy." He turned back to address the entire class. Had the Melosian delegation been properly... The emergency klaxon cut through his words like a plasma torch through polymer. A deep, resonating tone that pulsed 3 times before a computerized voice announced, "Security Protocol Omega initiated. All students and faculty remain in current locations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Professor Cal's exoskeleton paled visibly, a physiological response he couldn't control. In 10,000 cycles of Federation peace, there had never been a legitimate Omega alert. It signaled direct military threat to a Federation institution. "Students, please remain calm," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "The Academy security systems are the finest in the galaxy. I'm sure this is merely a—" The lecture hall doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. 6 armed figures stepped through, their armor a matte black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their helmets concealed any identifying features, but the distinctive ridge patterns on their armor marked them as Croth warriors, a militant splinter faction that had broken from the Federation 3 cycles earlier. The tallest warrior stepped forward, removing his helmet to reveal the characteristic bone crest and amber eyes of a Croth commander. His voice rasped through the translation matrix embedded in his throat armor. "By authority of the Black Fleet, this academy is now under our control. Cooperate, and you may survive this day. Resist, and you will not." Professor Cal moved protectively toward his students, his 4 arms spreading in a traditional posture of Vexillian guardianship. "This is a neutral academic institution. The galactic conventions clearly prohibit." The Croth commander's weapon discharged with a sharp crack. A stun pulse struck Professor Cal's thorax, sending him crumpling to the floor, his exoskeletal plates clicking against the polished surface. Panic erupted through the classroom. Several aquatic students began releasing distress pheromones that clouded the water in their respirator tanks. A pair of Palaxian twins huddled together, their crystalline bodies chiming in fear. 3 Taraxian students attempted to access emergency communicators, only to find all signals jammed. In the midst of the chaos, a Nilarian student with bioluminescent tendrils noticed something odd. The human, Alira Voss, was gone. Her seat was empty, though no one had seen her leave. The Croth commander seemed unconcerned with one missing student. He gestured to his soldiers, who began herding the class into a tight group at the center of the lecture hall. "The Federation Council has 20 standard hours to meet our demands," he announced. "Until then, you are our insurance policy." As the Croth warriors established control of Lecture Hall Zeta 9, none of them noticed the small maintenance hatch in the floor near the back row slowly closing, or the shadow that slipped away through the environmental control tunnels running beneath the Academy. The Academy's lower maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth of utility conduits, atmosphere regulation equipment, and backup life support systems. Few students knew of their existence, and fewer still had any reason to explore them. But Alira Voss was not like most students. During her first week at the Academy, she had obtained detailed schematics of the entire facility, not through any illicit means, but simply by requesting them from the Academy archives as part of a personal project on architectural adaptation for varying gravitic environments. No one had questioned why a diplomatic student needed such technical information. That was the advantage of being quiet. Alira had learned long ago. People rarely questioned what they didn't notice. She moved swiftly through the tunnels now, her footsteps silent on the metal grating. The emergency lighting cast long shadows that shifted as she passed. But Alira navigated with confidence. 3 cycles of exploring these tunnels during her off hours had given her an intimate knowledge of the Academy's infrastructure. Her destination was the secondary security hub, a small, unmanned control room that served as a backup for the main security center. If the Croth had taken control of the Academy as thoroughly as their commander's confidence suggested, they would have neutralized the main security center first. But the secondary hub, hidden away in the maintenance level and unmarked on standard Academy maps, might still be operational. As she approached the hub, Alira removed a small device from her pocket, a universal interface tool she had assembled from components in the Academy's fabrication lab. Another personal project that no one had questioned. The security hub's door recognized her student credentials, but required additional authorization for full access. Alira connected her interface tool to the door's control panel, running a bypass sequence she had developed months ago out of intellectual curiosity, rather than any planned insurrection. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a compact room filled with monitoring equipment. As she had hoped, the systems were still active, though operating in emergency power conservation mode. The screens showed various locations throughout the academy, all of them now under Croth control. Alira accessed the central console, bringing up a tactical overview of the situation. The Croth had deployed approximately 60 warriors throughout the academy, concentrating their forces at key locations: the main communications center, the transportation hub, the administrative offices, and several large lecture halls where they were gathering hostages. In orbit above the academy, long-range sensors detected a Croth battlecruiser, the source of the jamming field that prevented any communication with the Federation fleet. The situation was dire, but not hopeless. Not yet. Alira's fingers flew over the console as she accessed the Academy's internal security protocols. As a diplomatic academy, rather than a military installation, the facility had limited defensive capabilities, primarily designed for containing laboratory accidents or restraining the occasional intoxicated student, rather than repelling armed invaders. But limited didn't mean useless. Not in the hands of someone who understood how to repurpose systems for unintended functions. She began by establishing a secure internal communication channel, one that operated on frequencies the Croth jamming systems wouldn't target because they were typically used for maintenance drone coordination. Next, she accessed the environmental control systems, giving herself the ability to adjust atmosphere composition, temperature, and gravity in specific sections of the academy. Finally, she downloaded the locations of all emergency equipment caches throughout the facility. The academy maintained supplies for various emergency scenarios: medical emergencies, atmosphere contamination, power failures, and even the remote possibility of meteor impacts. None were designed for combat. But that didn't mean they couldn't be adapted. As she worked, Alira's mind drifted briefly to her training on Earth. Unlike most Federation worlds, where technology and societal advancement had eliminated the need for survival training, Earth still required its citizens to master basic survival skills. The harsh environments of Earth's various regions demanded respect and preparation. "The universe doesn't care about your comfort," her instructor had often said. "It only respects those who prepare for its indifference." Those lessons had shaped Alira in ways her classmates couldn't understand. While they debated theoretical diplomatic scenarios in comfortable lecture halls, she had learned to construct shelters in sub-zero temperatures, purify water contaminated with toxic minerals, and fashion tools from seemingly useless materials. Skills that had seemed irrelevant in the peaceful halls of the Galactic Federal Academy suddenly felt vital. A notification flashed on the console, pulling her attention back to the present. The Croth commander was broadcasting a message throughout the academy. "Attention Federation weaklings. I am Commander Croth of the Black Fleet. Your pitiful security forces have been neutralized, and all exits are secured. We control this facility completely. The Federation Council has 20 standard hours to acknowledge our sovereignty over the Epsilon sector and withdraw all diplomatic presence from our claimed territories. Until then, you are our guests and our shields. Any Federation attempt to retake this facility will result in your immediate execution." Alira's expression hardened as she listened. The Croth were notorious for their brutality, and their willingness to sacrifice hostages had been well documented during previous conflicts. The Federation Council would attempt negotiation, as they always did, but the Croth weren't interested in compromise. This was a power play, pure and simple. She couldn't wait for Federation intervention. By the time help arrived, it would be too late for many of her fellow students and professors. No, this situation required immediate action, the kind that wasn't taught in diplomatic theory classes. Alira pulled up the Academy personnel records, searching for potential allies. She needed people with specific skills and knowledge, and the courage to act under pressure. Her search yielded several promising candidates. Professor Namix of Applied Xenobiology, whose laboratory contained chemicals that could be repurposed. Talon Rax, a Corvani engineering student who had military experience before joining the academy. And the Malosian twins, Sari and Dori, whose species' natural camouflage abilities could prove invaluable. Using the secure maintenance channel, Alira sent coded messages to each of them, providing instructions on how to access the maintenance tunnels and rendezvous at a designated emergency supply cache near the dormitory sector. As she prepared to leave the security hub, Alira paused to look at one final monitor screen. It showed Lecture Hall Zeta 9, where her classmates were now seated on the floor under the watchful eyes of two Croth guards. Professor Cal had regained consciousness and was speaking quietly to a group of frightened first-cycle students, his forearms making gentle, reassuring gestures despite his own obvious distress. Alira's typically expressionless face softened momentarily. Then she turned away, her resolve strengthening. There would be time for emotions later, if they survived. 3 hours later, Alira crouched in a narrow maintenance shaft above the Academy's eastern dormitory wing, carefully assembling what appeared to be a crude weapon. She had gathered components from various emergency kits and maintenance supplies, pressure canisters intended for fire suppression, electronic components from atmosphere sensors, and various pieces of metal and polymer tubing. To her left, Talon Rax watched with fascination as her nimble fingers connected the final circuits. "That's not standard Federation equipment," the Corvani student observed. His avian features twisted in an expression of concern. His feathered crest lay flat against his skull, a sign of anxiety in his species. "No," Alira agreed simply, continuing her work without elaboration. "Is it lethal?" Talon asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, despite the fact that they were alone in the maintenance shaft. Alira looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Non-lethal, but effective. It will deliver a concentrated electromagnetic pulse, combined with a concussive pressure wave, enough to disable their armor systems and disorient them without causing permanent injury." "Where did you learn to make something like this?" The question contained both admiration and apprehension. A ghost of a smile touched Alira's lips. "Earth survival training includes improvised tool construction. The principles are adaptable." Before Talon could respond, their communications device chimed softly, a signal from the Malosian twins, who had been scouting the dormitory area. Alira activated the device, and a hushed voice came through. "We've located 23 students being held in the main commons area. Sorry, or possibly Dori. Even Alira couldn't tell the twins apart," reported. 4 Croth guards. They're searching rooms systematically, gathering more students." "Security systems?" Alira asked. "Standard door controls only. The emergency lockdown systems haven't been activated in this sector." "Good. That gives us an advantage." Alira checked her makeshift device one final time. "Professor Namix?" Another voice joined the communication. "I've prepared the compound as requested. Quite ingenious, using respiratory adaptation formulae as a sedative delivery mechanism. Though I must register my ethical concerns about—" "Noted, Professor," Alira interrupted. "Are you in position?" A slight pause. "Yes, environmental control room accessed. I can introduce the compound through the commons area ventilation system on your signal." "Stand by," Alira turned to Talon. "Are you ready?" The Corvani's feathers rippled with nervous energy, but his eyes showed determination. "Ready, though I still think we should wait for Federation response. The diplomatic protocols for hostage situations clearly state—" "The Croth don't follow Federation protocols," Alira said, her voice carrying a hardness that silenced Talon immediately. "By the time a diplomatic solution is reached, how many of our fellow students will have suffered? How many might die as examples of Kroth resolve? She didn't wait for his response. Instead, turning back to the communications device. Execute in 3 minutes. Professor, introduce the compound at exactly 14:30. Sorry, Dory. Be prepared to guide students to the evacuation point once the guards are neutralized. Talon and I will handle the Kroth. As the others acknowledged their instructions, Alira began moving through the maintenance shaft toward an access point that would place her directly above the commons area. Talon followed close behind, his taloned feet making soft clicking sounds against the metal flooring. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he whispered. "Not this exactly, but something like this. Combat operations." Alira didn't turn around. "No." "Then how?" "Earth is classified as a death world for a reason. Talon," she said quietly. "We learn to assess threats, formulate responses, and execute plans from childhood. Not because we're naturally violent, but because our environment doesn't forgive unpreparedness." They reached the access point, a removable panel in the maintenance shaft that opened into the ceiling of the commons area below. Alira positioned herself to look through a small gap, surveying the situation. The commons area was a large, open space, normally used for student gatherings and informal study sessions. Now, 23 students of various species sat clustered in the center, surrounded by 4 Kroth warriors, whose weapons remained trained on the group. The students' expressions ranged from terrified to defiant, but all remained silent under the watchful eyes of their captors. Alira checked the time. 14:29. She removed a small respirator from her pocket and placed it over her nose and mouth, motioning for Talon to do the same with the one she had provided him earlier. At exactly 14:30, a barely perceptible hiss emanated from the ventilation systems surrounding the commons area. The change was subtle, a slightly sweet odor that most species wouldn't even notice, but its effects became apparent within seconds. One of the Kroth guards tilted his head, as if listening to something. Another shook his helmet, as though trying to clear his vision. Within 30 seconds, all 4 guards had begun to show signs of disorientation, movements becoming sluggish, weapons dipping toward the floor. "Now," Alira whispered, removing the access panel and dropping silently into the room below. Her makeshift device clutched in one hand. Talon followed, his wings extending slightly to slow his descent. The nearest Kroth guard turned toward the sound, but his reactions were delayed by the compound circulating through the air. Before he could raise his weapon, Alira had activated her device, directing it toward him. A concussive thump, accompanied by a flash of blue-white energy, erupted from the device. The guard's armor systems flickered and died, and he crumpled to the floor, incapacitated but breathing. Talon moved with surprising grace for his species, using his wings to propel himself toward a second guard. He delivered a precise strike to a vulnerable joint in the Kroth's armor, a weakness he had identified during his military service. The guard collapsed beside his comrade. The remaining 2 guards attempted to respond, but the sedative compound had compromised their reflexes. Alira dispatched them efficiently, with 2 more bursts from her device. The students watched in stunned silence as their captors were neutralized in less than a minute. Then, as realization dawned, several began to rise, only to be halted by Alira's raised hand. "Stay down," she commanded, her voice quiet, but carrying an authority that none questioned. "This facility is still under Kroth control. We have an evacuation route prepared, but we must move quickly and silently." As if on cue, the Malosian twins shimmered into visibility near the main entrance. Their chameleonic abilities had allowed them to remain undetected in the room throughout the operation. "The passage to sublevel 3 is clear," one of them reported. "We've disabled surveillance along the route." Alira nodded. "Professor Namix." The professor's voice came through their communication device. "Compound effects will begin dissipating in approximately 15 minutes. I suggest you expedite your evacuation." Understood. Alira turned to the bewildered students. Follow the Melosians. They'll lead you to a secure location. Bring nothing but yourselves. Move quickly. Stay silent. As the twins began organizing the evacuation, Talon approached Alira, who was collecting the Croth Guard's communication devices and weapons. That was impressive, he said, helping her secure the unconscious guards with restraints fashioned from power cable insulation. But what about the other hostages? There are hundreds of students and faculty members still held throughout the academy. Alira placed the collected Croth weapons into a storage compartment beneath the floor, accessible only to those who knew of the maintenance system's existence. We liberate them group by group. Each success provides more allies and resources. And if the Croth realize what's happening? Alira's dark eyes met his. They will, eventually. That's why our next target is their communication hub. We need to prevent them from coordinating their response when they discover their prisoners are disappearing. Talon's feathers rippled with concern. The communication hub will be heavily guarded. Yes, Alira agreed, checking the charge on her makeshift device. That's why I need you to help me build 4 more of these before we proceed. Word of resistance spread through the hidden channels of the academy, like water through a parched riverbed. Students and faculty, who had been rescued from Croth captivity, gathered in the forgotten emergency shelter beneath the academy's southern quadrant, a relic from the facility's early construction, when the Federation was young and still concerned with physical security. The shelter had been designed to house up to 500 beings in the event of atmospheric contamination or other environmental catastrophes. Its existence had been largely forgotten during 10 millennia of peace, mentioned only in historical documents and obsolete emergency protocols. But Alira had found references to it during her research into Academy infrastructure and had verified its location and functionality during her exploratory expeditions through the maintenance tunnels. Now, nearly 6 hours after the Croth invasion began, the shelter housed 178 liberated hostages, a fraction of the Academy's total population, but a significant achievement nonetheless. Professor Namix had established a makeshift medical area, treating minor injuries sustained during the Croth takeover and the subsequent evacuations. Talon Rax and several engineering students had formed a technical team, working to establish communication with Federation authorities despite the Croth jamming field. In a small side chamber that had once served as an emergency command center, Alira stood before a holographic display of the Academy, marking areas that had been cleared and identifying priority targets for the next phase of operations. Around her, a group of students and faculty who had emerged as leaders in the resistance effort listened intently. The Croth still hold approximately 400 hostages in these locations, Alira said, highlighting several areas on the display. Their forces are concentrated here, and here. 3 more sections illuminated. But their command center is located in the main administrative complex, heavily guarded and isolated from our current position. We've successfully liberated 6 holding areas without alerting their central command, contributed Sari, or Dory, Melosian. But they've begun to notice missing guards. Their patrols have increased in frequency and size. Professor Lirin, a Taraxian physicist whose crystalline body structure belied his surprising agility during their escape, raised a faceted appendage. The Croth battlecruiser remains in orbit. Even if we liberate all hostages, we cannot evacuate the Academy while their ship maintains position. Alira nodded, acknowledging the concern. That's why our primary objective must shift from evacuation to communication. If we can penetrate their jamming field and alert the Federation fleet, we create options. The communication hub is too heavily guarded, objected Vorin, a Palaxian security student who had proven invaluable in identifying Croth patrol patterns. They have at least 15 warriors stationed there, with redundant security protocols. We don't need the main communication hub, Alira replied, zooming the display to focus on a seemingly unremarkable section of the Academy's outer structure. There's a maintenance array here, used for calibrating the Academy's external sensors. It has limited transmission capability, but enough to send a narrow beam message if we can reconfigure it properly. Talon stepped forward, studying the location. That's on the Academy's exterior hull. We'd need to perform an EVA to access it. The acronym for Extravehicular Activity, a spacewalk, sent a ripple of concern through the group. Yes, Alira confirmed, and we'll need to disable the external sensors in that quadrant to avoid detection. That's suicide, Vorin stated flatly. The Croth will detect any airlock activation. Not if we use the environmental emergency protocols. Alira zoomed in further, revealing a small access point. This maintenance airlock was designed for emergency repairs. It operates on an independent system specifically to function during power failures or security lockdowns. Professor Namix joined the conversation, his elongated fingers tracing patterns in the air as he calculated. Even if you reach the array, the Croth jamming field is comprehensive. Standard Federation frequencies will be blocked. We don't use standard frequencies, Alira replied. We use a phase-shifted resonance pattern, matching the Croth's own communication system. Silence fell over the group as they processed her suggestion. You want to piggyback our signal on their own communications? Talon asked, his avian features expressing amazement. That's brilliant, and nearly impossible. Not impossible, Alira corrected. Just complicated. I'll need your help to modify a standard communication array to match their frequency patterns. Even if we succeed, Professor Lirin interjected. The Croth have threatened to execute hostages if the Federation attempts intervention. Alira's expression remained impassive, but her eyes held a cold determination. That's why we don't request military intervention. Not yet. We request a diplomatic channel, one the Croth cannot easily refuse without losing credibility with potential allies in the non-aligned systems. A new voice joined the discussion, Professor Marin Cal, who had been liberated during the third evacuation operation. His exoskeleton still bore scorch marks from the stun blast he had received hours earlier, but his 4 eyes were clear and focused. A diplomatic solution is always preferable, he said, moving to stand beside Alira. But the Croth have demonstrated they have no interest in genuine negotiation. They seek leverage, not resolution. Precisely, Alira agreed. Which is why we create our own leverage. While the diplomatic channel distracts them, we continue our evacuation operations. The fewer hostages they control, the weaker their position becomes. The group fell silent, considering the complex strategy. It wasn't a perfect plan. Too many variables. Too many opportunities for failure. But it offered hope, where minutes earlier there had been none. I spent 3 cycles teaching the importance of words in preventing conflict, Professor Cal said finally, his upper arms gesturing toward Alira. It seems I should have paid more attention to the importance of action when words fail. Alira met his gaze with the same direct intensity she had shown in countless classes. Words and action are not opposites, Professor. They are complementary tools. The most effective diplomat understands when each is required. The professor's exoskeleton shifted in what those familiar with Vexillian expressions would recognize as rueful acknowledgement. Indeed, a lesson this old teacher is learning rather late. He straightened, addressing the entire group. I believe Ms. Voss's strategy offers our best chance of survival. I support it fully. One by one, the others voiced their agreement. Even Vorin, the most skeptical among them, eventually conceded the plan's merits, though he insisted on accompanying Alira on the EVA mission to provide additional security. As the group dispersed to prepare for their assigned tasks, Professor Cal remained behind with Alira, who was making final adjustments to the holographic display. You never spoke much in my class, he observed quietly. Yet it seems you were learning more than any of us realized. Alira's hands paused briefly over the controls. I've found that listening often teaches more than speaking. A profound observation. The professor hesitated, then continued. May I ask, why did you choose diplomatic studies? With your particular skills, military service or security operations would seem more aligned with your abilities. Alira turned to face him fully. Because diplomacy is the only sustainable path to genuine peace. Military action can end conflicts, but only understanding can prevent them. A rare smile touched her lips. Though it seems both skill sets have their place. Professor Cal made a gesture of respectful acknowledgement. When we survive this, and I believe we will, I hope you'll consider speaking more frequently in class. Your perspective would benefit us all. Alira didn't respond verbally, but the slight inclination of her head conveyed acceptance of the sentiment. Then she turned back to the display, already focused on the next phase of their resistance. In another part of the academy, far from the hidden resistance gathering, a very different meeting was taking place. Commander Croth stood in what had once been the Academy Administrator's office, now converted to his temporary command center. Around him, his senior officers delivered reports on the occupation status. Security teams report all primary sectors secured. Commander, stated his second-in-command. Lieutenant Vax, hostages have been consolidated in 15 holding areas for more efficient control. Commander Croth nodded, his amber eyes fixed on a tactical display, similar to the one Alira was using many levels below. Federation response? As predicted. They've attempted to establish communication channels 3 times. Each time, they lead with appeals to galactic law and offers of negotiation. Vax's mandibles clicked in amusement. Their latest message included a reminder that harming neutral academic personnel violates 17 different conventions. A rumble of derisive laughter passed through the assembled officers. The Federation's dedication to diplomatic protocols was legendary, and, in the Croth's view, a fundamental weakness to be exploited. And the Council? Croth demanded, referring to the Federation's governing body. No official response to our demands yet. Their standard deliberation period is not yet complete. Vax paused, then added, Our intelligence suggests they are divided. The militant faction advocates immediate military response, but the diplomatic majority insists on exhausting all non-violent options first. Commander Croth made a dismissive gesture. Predictable. Their indecision is our advantage. He turned to another officer. Ship status. The Voidhammer maintains position, jamming field at full strength. No Federation vessels have approached beyond the outer marker. The tactical officer hesitated briefly. However, we have detected anomalous energy fluctuations in several sections of the Academy over the past 2 hours. Croth's crest stiffened, a sign of sudden attention. Explain! Minor power surges in environmental systems. Maintenance channels activating without logged requests. Isolated security node access. The officer displayed a schematic showing the locations. Each incident individually appears to be a system malfunction, but the pattern suggests resistance, Croth finished, his voice hardening. Organized resistance. The room fell silent as the officers processed this unexpected development. The Federation was known for many things, but armed resistance was not among them. Their species had evolved beyond such responses. Or so they claimed. Impossible, Lieutenant Vax finally stated. We neutralized all security personnel during the initial assault. The remaining population consists of academics and students, beings who debate the ethical implications of using force, even in theoretical scenarios. Commander Croth studied the pattern of anomalies more carefully. Never underestimate desperate prey, Lieutenant. Even the most docile creature will fight when cornered. He zoomed in on specific locations. These access patterns suggest movement through maintenance systems. Dispatch security teams to these junctions. Install motion sensors throughout the environmental control network. Immediately, Commander. And perform an immediate headcount of all hostages, Croth added, his instincts now fully alert to the potential threat. Compare current numbers with initial estimates. As his officers hurried to implement his orders, Croth remained studying the display. Something about the pattern nagged at his tactical sense. These weren't random acts of desperation. The incidents formed a cohesive strategy, systematic, deliberate, and effective. Someone within the academy wasn't just resisting. They were conducting a counter-operation with military precision. His thoughts were interrupted by the return of Lieutenant Vax, whose rigid posture immediately conveyed unwelcome news. Report, Croth demanded. Hostage counts show discrepancies. Commander, we estimate approximately 170 beings are unaccounted for. Vax's voice remained steady, but his secondary breathing vents flared, a sign of agitation in his species. Additionally, 12 security teams have failed to report in over the past 4 hours. Anger flashed through Croth, but he controlled it instantly. Anger clouded judgment, and he needed clarity now more than ever. Locations of the missing security teams? Vax displayed a new schematic. The pattern was unmistakable, a systematic clearing operation working from the Academy's periphery inward. Increase security at all remaining hostage locations, Croth ordered. Triple the guards at the communication hub and command center, and initiate Protocol Vertex. The last command caused Vax to hesitate. Commander, Protocol Vertex would require executing hostages as a demonstration. The diplomatic ramifications are irrelevant if we lose control of this facility. Croth interrupted sharply. Select 5 hostages from different species. Public execution in 1 hour. Broadcast throughout the Academy. Make it clear that for each further act of resistance, 10 more will die. Vax saluted and departed to implement the orders, leaving Commander Croth alone with the tactical display. He studied it intently, trying to anticipate his opponent's next move. Whoever was coordinating this resistance understood asymmetric warfare, using limited resources to maximum effect against a superior force. Such tactics were rare in the Federation, where military conflict had been theoretical rather than practical for millennia. This suggested his opponent had specialized training or came from one of the few Federation worlds that still maintained combat readiness. A suspicion formed in his mind. He accessed the Academy's student records, which his technical team had downloaded during the initial assault. Filtering for species from high-gravity worlds with recent histories of environmental conflict, he quickly identified several candidates. One name in particular caught his attention: Alira Voss, human female, 3rd cycle diplomatic student from Earth. Earth, classified as a death world due to its harsh conditions and dangerous indigenous life forms. Humans were physiologically adapted to survive conditions that would kill most Federation species. With greater bone density, more efficient oxygen processing, and accelerated healing capabilities. More importantly, Earth's fractured political history meant its educational system still included basic survival and tactical training, despite the planet's Federation membership. Commander Croth studied the student file with growing interest. Alira Voss had exceptional academic records, but minimal social presence. Few extracurricular activities, no registered relationships, and instructors consistently noted her reluctance to participate in class discussions, despite demonstrated mastery of the material. The perfect profile for someone who observed, analyzed, and acted with precision when necessary. So, he murmured to himself, I face a Deathworlder. He closed the file and opened a communication channel to his ship. Prepare a detailed tactical analysis of human combat methodologies. Priority focus on Earth military doctrines regarding hostage scenarios and asymmetric warfare. As he awaited the information, Croth felt something he had not experienced in many cycles: genuine anticipation. The operation had been proceeding exactly as planned, almost disappointingly so. Now, an unexpected variable had introduced itself, a worthy challenge. The commander's mandibles clicked in what passed for a smile among his species. The Deathworlder girl would make for interesting prey. The maintenance airlock was barely large enough for two beings to occupy simultaneously. Designed for emergency repairs rather than routine EVA operations, it lacked the comfortable amenities of standard airlocks. No preparation area, minimal atmospheric cycling capabilities, and emergency suits that prioritized functionality over comfort. Alira and Vorin stood pressed against opposite walls as the cramped chamber depressurized. Their emergency suits, located in a storage compartment near the airlock, were designed to accommodate a wide range of physiologies, but optimized for none. Vorin's Palaxian frame, with its crystalline protrusions, strained against the suit's confines. Alira's smaller human form fared somewhat better, though the suit's arms were slightly too long for her proportions. "Final equipment check," Alira said through the suit's communication system, her voice calm despite the circumstances. Vorin verified his tether, oxygen supply, and the modified communication array they had constructed from parts salvaged throughout the Academy. "Functional," he reported tersely, "though I maintain this plan has a probability of success that rounds effectively to 0. "Noted," Alira replied without inflection. She had come to appreciate the Palaxian's pessimistic pragmatism over the past hours. He questioned everything, but executed his tasks with perfect precision, once convinced, or at least resigned, to a course of action. The airlock's status indicator shifted from amber to green, signaling complete depressurization. The outer door slid open, revealing the void of space beyond, a stunning vista of stars against absolute darkness. With the purple-tinged curve of the moon, Nexus visible at the edge of their field of view. "Remember," Alira said as she secured her tether to the airlock's exterior anchor point. "Minimal thruster usage. The Croth sensors will be calibrated to detect standard EVA movement patterns." Vorin's crystalline features were obscured by his helmet, but his voice carried a note of dry humor. "Yes, because my extensive spacewalking experience might lead me to forget such a critical detail." Alira didn't respond to the sarcasm. Instead, focusing on navigating along the Academy's exterior hull, using handholds rather than thrusters. The maintenance array was located approximately 200 meters from their position, a considerable distance to traverse using only manual locomotion in zero gravity. They moved in silence for several minutes, conserving oxygen and focusing on the precise movements required to maintain their course without triggering motion sensors. The Academy's exterior was dotted with sensor nodes, environmental regulation equipment, and communication arrays, all potential detection points if approached carelessly. As they neared their target, Vorin suddenly gripped Alira's arm, halting their progress. He pointed toward a section of hull 30 meters ahead, where a maintenance drone was performing routine inspections. "Automated or remote-controlled?" Alira asked, her body instantly motionless. Vorin studied the drone's movement pattern. "Automated. Standard diagnostic routine." He paused, calculating. "It will complete its current sector in approximately 45 seconds. Then move to the adjacent quadrant, away from our target." They waited, perfectly still, as the drone continued its pre-programmed routine. True to Vorin's prediction, it eventually chirped a completion signal and propelled itself to another section of the hull, its sensors facing away from them. "Now," Vorin said, and they resumed their careful progress toward the maintenance array. The array itself was a relatively simple piece of equipment, a modular sensor package used for calibrating the Academy's external scientific instruments. Its primary function was to provide baseline readings of background radiation, particulate density, and gravitational fluctuations. What made it valuable to their mission was its independent power supply, and its ability to transmit data on multiple frequencies simultaneously. With the modifications Talon had helped design, they could potentially use it to pierce the Croth jamming field, not with a broad-spectrum transmission that would be immediately detected and blocked, but with a narrow beam signal precisely modulated to blend with the Croth's own communication frequency. Alira reached the array first, securing herself to an adjacent anchor point before carefully removing the array's exterior access panel. Inside, a complex arrangement of circuitry and transmission components gleamed in the harsh, unfiltered starlight. "Beginning modifications," she said, removing a small toolkit and the specialized components they had brought for the task. "Monitor perimeter." Vorin positioned himself to watch for drones or other potential threats while Alira worked. Her gloved hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the bulky emergency suit, connecting their modified transmitter to the array's power source and integrating it with the existing transmission system. "You have experience with electronic systems beyond standard diplomatic training," Vorin observed through their private communication channel. Alira continued working without looking up. Earth educational standards include basic technical skills, regardless of specialization. Basic skills don't typically extend to modifying complex communication arrays while performing EVA operations, Vorin countered. "Your capabilities suggest specialized training." For a moment, Alira's hands paused. Then she resumed her work, connecting the final components. "My father was a communications engineer on deep space expeditions. I spent my childhood on survey ships before attending the academy." The admission seemed to satisfy Vorin, who nodded slightly within his helmet. "That explains much." Alira completed the installation, carefully securing the components against the vibrations that might occur during transmission. "System ready. Initiating transmission sequence." She activated the modified array, which hummed softly as it powered up. A small display on their added component showed a sequence of encryption protocols activating, followed by frequency modulation patterns designed to disguise their signal as normal background noise in the Croth communication system. "Message loaded," Alira confirmed. "Transmission commencing." The message itself was brief but comprehensive. A detailed account of the Academy's situation, the Croth demands, and the ongoing resistance efforts. Most importantly, it included a request not for military intervention, but for a public diplomatic channel that would force the Croth to engage in visible negotiation rather than secret ultimatums. "Transmission complete," Alira announced after several tense minutes. "No detectable countermeasures activated." Vorin checked his suit's chronometer. "We should return immediately. The Croth will be conducting their next patrol sweep in approximately 12 minutes. Alira replaced the array's access panel, carefully ensuring it appeared undisturbed. "Agreed. Same route back. Minimal thruster usage." They had begun their return journey when Vorin's communication channel suddenly crackled with an incoming transmission, not from their resistance allies, but on an open Academy frequency. "Attention all Academy personnel and guests." The harsh, translated voice of Commander Croth filled their helmets. "It appears some among you believe resistance is possible against the Black Fleet. This delusion ends now." Alira and Vorin exchanged concerned glances, but continued their careful progress toward the airlock. "In 1 standard hour, 5 hostages will be executed as demonstration of our resolve. For each subsequent act of defiance, 10 more will die. This is not negotiable." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of their breathing in the communication channel. "We need to move faster," Alira said, abandoning the cautious handhold method and activating her suit's thrusters in controlled, irregular bursts designed to mimic debris movement rather than deliberate navigation. Vorin followed her example, his crystalline features set in grim determination. "Even if our transmission reached the Federation fleet, they cannot respond in time to prevent the executions." "No," Alira agreed, her voice steady despite the acceleration of their movement. Which means we need a new strategy. When they returned to the resistance shelter, they found the atmosphere transformed. The Kroth commander's announcement had spread panic among the liberated hostages, many of whom had friends or family members still held captive throughout the academy. Talon met them at the airlock, his feathers flat against his skull in distress. "You heard?" "Yes," Alira replied, removing her helmet as soon as the chamber repressurized. "Where's Professor Cal?" Attempting to calm the others, many want to surrender themselves in exchange for the condemned hostages. Alira moved swiftly through the shelter, Vorin close behind. The main chamber was filled with voices, some raised in argument, others hushed in fear. Professor Cal stood in the center, his four arms raised in a traditional Vexillian gesture, requesting attention. "Please," he was saying, "consider the tactical reality. Surrendering ourselves accomplishes nothing except giving the Kroth more hostages to threaten." "So we just let them die?" demanded a Nilarian student, her bioluminescent tendrils flashing with emotional distress. "They're targeting specific species representatives, one from each major Federation member world. My clutch sister is the only Nilarian in advanced xenobiology." Similar concerns echoed through the chamber as other students realized their own friends and family members might be among the chosen examples. Alira moved to stand beside Professor Cal, her presence somehow commanding attention despite her comparatively small stature. The room gradually quieted as she surveyed the gathered beings. "The transmission was successful," she announced without preamble. "The Federation now knows our situation, but they cannot intervene militarily without risking all remaining hostages." Murmurs of dismay rippled through the crowd. "However," she continued, "we have an alternative. The Kroth are holding the condemned hostages in the central auditorium, a symbolic location chosen to maximize the psychological impact of the executions." Talon stepped forward. "How do you know this?" "Because it's what I would do," Alira replied simply. "And the auditorium appears on their patrol schedule with triple the normal guard complement." She activated a holographic display, showing the Academy's central section. The auditorium has 3 primary entrances, all heavily guarded, but it also has a weakness: the environmental control system. The display zoomed in, highlighting a network of ventilation shafts and atmospheric regulation equipment surrounding the auditorium. During graduation ceremonies, the atmospheric composition is adjusted to accommodate multiple species simultaneously. Alira explained. "This requires a more robust system than standard ventilation, large enough for maintenance drones to navigate for repairs." Understanding dawned on Professor Namix's features. "Large enough for some of us to move through as well." "Precisely." Alira highlighted a specific route. "This maintenance access connects to our current location through secondary tunnels. It would allow a small team to infiltrate the auditorium's environmental control room, which is typically unmanned during non-ceremonial periods." "And then what?" Vorin asked, his crystalline features refracting light as he studied the proposed route. "Even if we reach the control room, we would still face armed Kroth warriors with hostages." Alira's expression remained impassive, but her eyes held a cold determination. "We use their tactics against them. The Kroth rely on fear and the threat of escalating violence. We demonstrate that such methods have consequences." She turned to Professor Namix. "The compound you created to sedate the Kroth guards earlier, can it be modified to affect only Kroth physiology?" The professor's elongated fingers twitched in a gesture of scientific consideration. "Theoretically, yes. Their respiratory system has distinct characteristics that could be targeted specifically, but the concentration required would be significant, potentially harmful to the Kroth if exposure is prolonged." "Can you create it with a built-in neutralizing agent that activates after a predetermined period?" Alira pressed. "Ensuring they're incapacitated long enough for us to secure the hostages, But not permanently harmed? Professor Namix considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, it would require precise calibration, but it's possible. Good. Alira turned back to the larger group. We need a small team, no more than 4, to infiltrate the environmental control room and introduce the compound. Simultaneously, we'll need to create a distraction to draw attention away from the auditorium. Talon's feathers rippled with concern. What kind of distraction? A security breach in the opposite quadrant, Alira replied. Something significant enough to divert Kroth forces without immediately triggering hostage executions. The Melosian twins stepped forward, their chameleonic skin shifting slightly to match the emotional tenor of the moment. We can create such a distraction, one of them offered. Our natural abilities allow us to trigger security systems without being detected. Alira nodded in acknowledgement. Professor Cal, I need you to prepare a diplomatic statement, something we can broadcast throughout the Academy once we've secured the hostages. A message that offers the Kroth a face-saving exit strategy, while making it clear further violence will not be tolerated. The professor's exoskeleton shifted in a pattern of surprise. You believe they would accept such terms after we've directly challenged their authority? No, Alira admitted. But the message isn't for the Kroth commander. It's for his subordinates, and for the Federation representatives who will receive our next transmission. We need to maintain the moral high ground while demonstrating our capacity for effective resistance. Understanding dawned in Professor Cal's 4 eyes. Ah, practical diplomacy indeed. Plans formed quickly after that. The infiltration team would consist of Alira, Vorin, Professor Namix, and a Centaurian engineering student named Larix, whose species' natural agility made them ideal for navigating confined spaces. The Melosian twins would create a distraction by triggering fire suppression systems in the Academy's northern research wing, far from any hostage-holding areas, but important enough to demand Kroth attention. As the others prepared, Professor Cal drew Alira aside, his voice low and concerned. This plan puts you at extreme risk, he observed. If captured, the Kroth will make an example of you. Particularly if Commander Kroth realizes you're the resistance leader. Alira checked the makeshift electromagnetic disruptor she had created earlier, ensuring its charge was still optimal. Risk is inevitable in any meaningful action, Professor. True, but unnecessary sacrifice serves no one. The professor hesitated, then added, You've proven your point. Alira, you've demonstrated that effective diplomacy sometimes requires force to support it. There's no need to personally lead this mission. Alira looked up, meeting his 4-eyed gaze directly. I don't do this to prove a point, Professor. I do it because I can. Because my specific abilities and training make me the most qualified person for this task. A rare smile touched her lips. Isn't that what diplomacy teaches us? To recognize and leverage individual strengths for collective benefit. Professor Cal's exoskeleton shifted in a pattern that indicated both resignation and respect. You would have made an exceptional diplomat, Ms. Voss. The mission isn't over yet, Professor, Alira replied, securing her equipment. I still intend to attend your lecture on cross-cultural communication next week. As she moved to join the infiltration team, Alira felt a familiar calm settling over her, the same focused awareness she had developed during Earth's survival training exercises. Her mind cleared of extraneous concerns, leaving only the mission parameters and contingency plans. The next hour would determine not just the fate of 5 hostages, but potentially the outcome of the entire Kroth occupation. Failure would result in deaths and a devastating blow to resistance morale. Success would shift the balance of power and create new possibilities for resolution. Alira checked her chronometer. 53 minutes until the scheduled executions. Time to move. The ventilation maintenance tunnels were significantly more challenging to navigate than the standard maintenance shafts Alira had explored previously. Designed for drone access rather than biological entities, they offered minimal clearance, forcing the infiltration team to crawl on hands and knees, or equivalent appendages, for much of their journey. Alira led the way, with Professor Namix following closely behind, carrying a sealed container with the modified compound. Lurix came next, the Centaurian's flexible spine, allowing for more comfortable movement in the confined space. Vorin brought up the rear, his crystalline body occasionally scraping against the tunnel walls despite his careful movements. "Junction ahead," Alira whispered, consulting the schematic displayed on a small device strapped to her wrist. "Environmental control room should be 3 segments beyond." They reached the junction, a point where 4 separate tunnels converged to form a small maintenance hub. Alira paused, listening intently for any sound that might indicate Kroth presence nearby. Hearing nothing, she gestured for the others to follow as she took the rightmost passage. The tunnel narrowed further, forcing them to proceed in single file with even less clearance than before. The air grew warmer, a sign they were approaching active environmental systems. After several more minutes of careful progress, they reached a grated panel that overlooked a small control room filled with atmospheric regulation equipment. Through the grate, they could see displays showing temperature, pressure, and atmospheric composition settings for various Academy sectors. Alira motioned for silence as she carefully removed the grate, creating an opening large enough for them to descend into the room below. She went first, dropping silently to the floor and immediately scanning for security systems or unexpected personnel. Finding none, she signaled the others to follow. One by one, they emerged from the tunnel, with Vorin requiring assistance due to his less flexible physiology. "Security status?" Alira asked Lurix, who immediately moved to a control console. The Centaurian's 6-fingered hands danced over the interface. "No active monitoring in this section. Environmental systems operating on standard automation protocols." A pause as they accessed additional data. "Auditorium atmospheric settings have been adjusted to Kroth optimal conditions. Higher nitrogen content, reduced oxygen." Professor Namix approached another console, analyzing the atmospheric data. "This is useful. Their modified environment makes them even more susceptible to the compound I've prepared." He removed several vials from his container, each filled with a pale blue liquid. "We can introduce it directly through the auditorium's dedicated ventilation system." Alira checked her chronometer. 28 minutes until the scheduled executions. "Lurix, can you access visual monitoring of the auditorium?" The Centaurian nodded, their elongated cranium bobbing slightly as they redirected the console's output. Environmental systems include basic visual monitoring for maintenance purposes. Limited resolution, but functional. The display shifted to show a grainy image of the Academy's central auditorium, a large, amphitheater-style space, normally used for formal addresses and graduation ceremonies. Now, it contained approximately 20 Kroth warriors, positioned strategically throughout the chamber. On the central stage, 5 beings of different species knelt with restraints, binding their limbs, while a Kroth officer paced before them, occasionally gesturing with what appeared to be a ceremonial weapon. "Can you identify the hostages?" Alira asked, studying the image carefully. Lurix adjusted the display, zooming in as much as the limited resolution allowed. Difficult to confirm with certainty, but based on morphology: a Nilarian, a Taraxian, a Vexillian, a Melosian, and... They hesitated, adjusting the image further. "The 5th appears to be human." A tense silence fell over the group. The Kroth had indeed selected representatives from major Federation species, a calculated move designed to maximize political impact. Vorin studied the Kroth positions displayed on the monitor. Too many for direct confrontation, even with the compound, and they're dispersed throughout the chamber. Some would likely remain functional long enough to execute hostages. We don't confront them directly, Alira replied, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. Professor, how quickly will your compound take effect once introduced into the ventilation system? Professor Namix calculated briefly. At this concentration, initial symptoms within 30 seconds. Full incapacitation within 90 seconds for most Kroth physiology. The commander may have enhanced respiratory filtration in his armor. Could take longer. And it will affect only the Kroth? Alira confirmed. The hostages will remain unharmed? Yes. The compound targets specific receptor configurations unique to Kroth biology. Other species may experience mild drowsiness at worst, but nothing debilitating. Alira nodded. Decision made. Here's what we do. We introduce the compound gradually, increasing concentration over a period of 2 minutes. This creates progressive disorientation rather than sudden incapacitation, making it less likely they'll realize what's happening until it's too late. She turned to Lyrics. While the compound takes effect, you'll override the auditorium's lighting and sound systems, maximum disorientation protocols, the kind used during emergency evacuations. Understood, the Centaurian acknowledged, already accessing the relevant controls. Vorin and I will enter through these access points, Alira continued, indicating 2 maintenance hatches visible on the auditorium schematic. Once the Kroth are sufficiently disoriented, we secure the hostages and move them to the evacuation route we identified earlier. Professor Namix's elongated fingers twitched nervously. And if some Kroth remain functional despite the compound? Alira patted the electromagnetic disruptor secured at her hip. That's why we bring insurance. A soft chime from Lyrix's console interrupted the discussion. The distraction team is in position. They await our signal to proceed. Tell them to execute in precisely 5 minutes, Alira instructed. That should give us time to prepare the compound delivery system and synchronize our entry, as the others move to implement their assigned tasks. Alira took a moment to study the auditorium display once more. The Kroth commander, identifiable by his distinctive armor and the deference shown by other warriors, had arrived and was now addressing the assembled Kroth forces. Even without audio, his posture conveyed pride and anticipation, a predator savoring the moment before a kill. Alira's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She had spent her academic career studying how to prevent conflicts through understanding and communication. Now, she would demonstrate that sometimes protection required more direct approaches. Systems ready, Lyrix announced. Compound delivery program for gradual increase over 120 seconds, followed by purge cycle at your command. Distraction team activating in 3 minutes, Vorin added, monitoring a separate communication channel. Professor Namix approached Alira, lowering his voice. I've modified 2 respirator masks for you and Vorin. They'll filter the compound completely, ensuring you both remain fully functional, regardless of concentration levels. Alira accepted the mask with a nod of thanks. Join the evacuation team once we've secured the hostages. Your medical expertise may be needed. Of course. The professor hesitated, then added, Your strategy is remarkable. A perfect balance of force and restraint. Not what one might expect from a Deathworlder, Alira finished, a hint of dry amusement in her voice. Professor Namix had the grace to look embarrassed. I was going to say a diplomatic student. The goal of both survival training and diplomacy is the same. Professor, Alira replied, securing the respirator mask around her neck, ready to pull up when needed. To achieve the best possible outcome with minimal harm to all parties. A notification from Lyrix's console signaled that the distraction team had initiated their operation. Moments later, emergency alarms began blaring throughout the northern quadrant of the Academy, and the monitoring systems showed Kroth forces responding to the apparent security breach. Compound delivery initiating, Professor Namix announced, activating the system he had prepared. Stage 1, concentration entering ventilation now. On the monitor, They watched as the auditorium continued to function normally. The Kroth commander appeared to receive a communication, gesturing sharply to several warriors who immediately departed, presumably to investigate the distraction. Stage 2, concentration, Professor Namix reported after 60 seconds. The first signs of effect became visible on the monitor. A Kroth warrior, near one of the ventilation outlets, shook his head suddenly, as if to clear it. Another shifted his stance, reaching up to adjust his helmet. The movements were subtle, barely noticeable unless one was specifically looking for them. Disorientation beginning, Alira observed. Lurix, prepare lighting and sound protocols. Vorin, with me. They moved to their respective access points, maintenance hatches that would allow them to enter the auditorium near the stage area. Alira pulled the respirator mask over her face, ensuring a proper seal before checking her equipment one final time. Stage 3, concentration, came Professor Namix's voice through their communication devices. Maximum effective level reached. On the monitor, the effects were now unmistakable. Multiple Kroth warriors were visibly struggling to maintain their positions. Some had removed their helmets, a critical error that would only increase their exposure to the compound. The commander remained upright, but his movements had become jerky, uncoordinated. Execute disorientation protocols now, Alira commanded. Lurix activated the prepared systems. Inside the auditorium, the lighting suddenly shifted to a strobing pattern designed to disorient and confuse. Simultaneously, the sound system erupted with a cacophony of discordant tones specifically calibrated to the sensitive range of Kroth hearing. Go, Alira ordered, and she and Vorin opened their access hatches, entering the auditorium from opposite sides of the stage area. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Most of the Kroth warriors were already on their knees or leaning heavily against walls, their neurological systems overwhelmed by the combination of the compound, strobing lights, and disorienting sounds. Those still standing moved with the clumsy, uncoordinated motions of severe intoxication. Alira moved swiftly toward the hostages, her makeshift disruptor ready. One Kroth warrior noticed her approach and attempted to raise his weapon, but his movements were so sluggish that Alira easily sidestepped and delivered a precisely targeted electromagnetic pulse that disabled his armor systems completely. Across the stage, Vorin was similarly engaged, his crystalline form reflecting the strobing lights as he neutralized a Kroth guard who had managed to remain partially functional despite the compound. The hostages watched with expressions ranging from confusion to desperate hope as Alira reached them. The human hostage, a first cycle student Alira recognized from the diplomatic theory department, stared with wide eyes as she used a microcutter to remove his restraints. "You're the quiet girl from Advanced Cultural Studies," he said incredulously as his bonds fell away. Alira nodded once, moving quickly to free the other hostages. "Exit through that maintenance hatch," she instructed, pointing to where Vorin was now standing guard. "Follow the marked path. Others will guide you to safety." As the last hostage was freed, Alira turned her attention to the Kroth commander, who remained standing despite the compound's effects. His armor, more advanced than that of his subordinates, included enhanced filtration systems that had partially protected him from the full impact of the sedative compound. He stood at the center of the stage, swaying slightly, but still clutching his ceremonial weapon, a wicked-looking blade that symbolized Kroth authority. His amber eyes, visible through his helmet's transparent faceplate, fixed on Alira with recognition and fury. "Deathworlder," he rasped, the translation matrix in his armor distorting his voice further than usual. "You think this changes outcome?" Alira approached cautiously, her disruptor aimed at his armor's primary power junction. "It already has," she replied calmly. "Your hostages are free. Your warriors are incapacitated. Your leverage is gone." The commander lurched forward, attempting to strike with his blade, but the movement was telegraphed and sluggish. Alira easily evaded, circling to maintain distance while studying his armor for vulnerabilities. Federation. Weak, the commander growled, struggling to remain upright. Need. Deathworlders. To fight. Battles. The Federation doesn't believe in battles, Alira corrected, still circling. It believes in cooperation and mutual benefit. But that doesn't mean we won't defend ourselves when necessary. Another clumsy attack, another easy evasion. The commander's systems were failing progressively as the compound continued to affect him despite his armor's filtration. You should have killed me, he managed, his voice growing weaker. Showing mercy proves weakness. Alira moved suddenly, striking with precise timing at a junction in his armor that her observations had identified as vulnerable. The electromagnetic pulse from her disruptor cascaded through his systems, shutting down power assistance and communication capabilities simultaneously. The commander collapsed to his knees, his weapon clattering to the stage beside him. Mercy isn't weakness, Alira said, standing over him as his consciousness began to fade from the compound's effects. It's the luxury of the truly powerful. The commander's amber eyes fixed on hers, one last time, wide with something that might have been fear, or perhaps a new kind of understanding. Then they closed as he slumped forward, unconscious but alive. Alira turned away, activating her communication device. Hostages secured. Commander neutralized. Initiate ventilation purge and broadcast diplomatic statement. As she made her way toward the maintenance hatch where Vorin waited, Professor Cal's voice came through the Academy-wide communication system, calm, measured, and authoritative. Attention Kroth forces. This is Professor Marin Cal of the Galactic Federal Academy, speaking on behalf of all beings currently under your occupation. Your commander has been incapacitated. Your hostages have been secured. Your demonstration of force has failed. The professor paused briefly before continuing. We offer you the following terms. Withdraw your forces peacefully, and no further action will be taken against you. The Federation Council has been contacted and awaits communication to formalize this arrangement. Violence against any Academy personnel will be met with immediate and proportional response. You have 30 minutes to signal your acceptance by powering down weapon systems and returning to your vessel. Alira reached the maintenance hatch, joining Vorin as they prepared to follow the evacuation route to rejoin the resistance group. Do you think they'll accept the terms? Vorin asked quietly as they moved through the narrow passage. Alira considered the question carefully before responding. Their commander is incapacitated. Their hostages are gone. Their leverage is neutralized. Continuing the occupation offers no strategic advantage and risks further embarrassment. She paused, then added, and they've just witnessed what happens when they underestimate supposedly peaceful Federation species. Vorin's crystalline features shifted in what might have been a smile. Particularly Deathworlders who sit quietly in diplomatic classes. For the first time since the crisis began, Alira allowed herself a genuine smile in return. Particularly those 26 hours after the Kroth invasion began. The last Black Fleet warrior departed the Academy. Their battlecruiser, the Voidhammer, broke orbit without further hostilities, retreating toward the sector boundary where a Federation diplomatic vessel waited to formalize their withdrawal agreement. In the Academy's main administrative chamber, an emergency session of faculty and student representatives had convened to assess damage, coordinate recovery efforts, and debrief Federation officials who had arrived once the situation was resolved. Alira sat quietly at the back of the chamber, listening as Professor Cal and others recounted the events of the occupation and the resistance efforts. The professor's telling was diplomatic yet accurate, acknowledging the contributions of numerous students and faculty members who had participated in various aspects of the resistance. When he mentioned Alira's role, he did so with careful moderation, noting her strategic insights and technical contributions, without elaborating on the full extent of her leadership or actions. Alira had requested this discretion, preferring to avoid the attention that would inevitably follow a more detailed account of her involvement. As the meeting progressed to discussions of security protocol revisions and academic schedule adjustments, Alira slipped quietly from the chamber. The crowded, emotional atmosphere had begun to wear on her after the intense focus of the past day. She made her way to a small observation deck overlooking the Academy's central quad, a place she often visited when seeking solitude between classes. The transparent dome provided a panoramic view of Nexus's purple-tinged atmosphere and the stars beyond, a reminder of the vast galaxy the Federation sought to unite through understanding rather than force. Footsteps behind her announced she was not alone. Turning, she found Professor Cal approaching, his exoskeleton now repaired and polished to its usual iridescent sheen. "I thought I might find you here," he said, moving to stand beside her at the observation railing. "You left before the Federation Security Council representative could personally express their gratitude." Alira shrugged slightly. "The outcome is what matters, not recognition. A sentiment many claim to hold, but few genuinely practice." The professor's four eyes studied her with newfound respect. "The Federation Council has requested a comprehensive review of our security protocols and emergency response training. They've suggested incorporating certain practical elements that have been previously overlooked in favor of purely theoretical approaches." "A reasonable adjustment," Alira observed neutrally. "Indeed." Professor Cal's upper arms made a gesture of thoughtful consideration. "They've also requested that you consider consulting on the revisions, given your demonstrated expertise in alternative diplomatic solutions." Alira turned to face him fully, surprise briefly visible in her expression. "I'm still a student, Professor. A student who accomplished what an entire Federation security response team might have struggled to achieve." His exoskeleton shifted in what Alira had come to recognize as his equivalent of a smile. "Sometimes, the most valuable insights come from unexpected sources." Alira considered his words, gazing back out at the stars. "I didn't come to the Academy to teach security protocols, Professor. I came to learn diplomacy. And yet you've demonstrated that true diplomacy requires understanding all available tools, including those we'd prefer not to use." The professor joined her in contemplating the view. "The Federation has maintained peace for 10,000 cycles, because we convinced ourselves that words alone were sufficient. Perhaps we needed a reminder that peace must sometimes be enforced." They stood in companionable silence for several moments before Professor Cal spoke again, his tone more personal than academic. "May I ask you something, Ms. Voss?" Alira nodded slightly. "Throughout this crisis, you demonstrated remarkable composure. No hesitation, no visible fear, even when facing direct confrontation with armed opponents." His upper eyes narrowed slightly in curiosity. "Is that a human trait, or something unique to you?" Alira considered the question carefully. "Humans experience fear as intensely as any species, Professor. We simply learn to function despite it, not in its absence." "A valuable adaptation for a Deathworld species," he observed. "For any sentient being," Alira corrected gently. "Fear serves a purpose. It heightens awareness and caution. Suppressing it entirely would be as dangerous as being paralyzed by it." The professor's exoskeleton shifted in a pattern that indicated thoughtful reassessment. "Another lesson for our diplomatic curriculum. Perhaps." He straightened, his four arms settling into a formal posture. "I should return to the administrative session. Your presence would be welcomed, but not required." "Thank you, Professor. I'll join shortly." As Professor Cal departed, Alira remained at the observation deck, her thoughts turning to the events of the past day. She had not anticipated that her first significant application of diplomatic theory would involve improvised weapons and tactical operations. Yet the outcome, resolution with minimal casualties and a potential for improved understanding, aligned perfectly with the core principles of Federation diplomacy. The crisis had revealed a blind spot in Federation educational philosophy, the assumption that peaceful intentions eliminated the need for practical defense capabilities. Perhaps her unique perspective as a Deathworlder could help bridge that gap, creating a more resilient approach to interspecies relations. A soft chime from her communication device interrupted her reflections. A message from Talon Rax, who had emerged as a trusted ally during the crisis. Administrative meeting adjourned. Federation representatives requesting your input on security revisions. Also, our xenobiology class is still scheduled for tomorrow morning. Despite everything. Will you attend? Alira smiled slightly at the message. Life at the academy would continue, changed but unbroken by the Kroth invasion. Students would return to classes, professors would resume lectures, and the pursuit of knowledge would continue. She sent a brief reply. I'll be there, both places. Tucking the device away, Alira took one last look at the stars, visible through the observation dome. The Federation's 10,000 cycles of peace had been interrupted, but not ended. Perhaps this crisis would ultimately strengthen, rather than weaken the alliance, reminding its members that true security came not from ignoring potential threats, but from preparing for them while still pursuing peaceful resolutions. With that thought, Alira turned and made her way back toward the administrative chamber, ready to contribute her unique perspective to the ongoing discussion. Her quiet demeanor would remain. She had no desire to become a celebrated figure within the academy, but her silence would no longer be mistaken for passivity or disengagement. The Deathworlder girl who had been silent in class had found her voice in action, and in doing so, had silenced an entire army. 2 weeks after the Kroth invasion, life at the Galactic Federal Academy had established a new normal. Physical damage to the facility had been repaired. Classes had resumed their regular schedules, and the initial surge of excitement surrounding the event had begun to fade as students returned to their academic routines. Changes were evident beneath the surface. However, security protocols had been significantly enhanced, with new systems designed to prevent unauthorized access to critical areas. Emergency response training had been added to the core curriculum for all students, regardless of their field of study, and subtle shifts in attitude could be observed among both faculty and students. A new appreciation for practical skills, alongside theoretical knowledge. In Lecture Hall Zeta 9, Professor Marin Cal was concluding a session on cross-cultural negotiation techniques. The room was full. Attendance had increased noticeably since the invasion, as students recognized the practical value of diplomatic training in unexpected situations. Remember, Professor Cal emphasized, his forearms gesturing to encompass the entire class. Effective negotiation requires understanding not only what your counterpart is saying, but why they are saying it. Cultural context, historical background, and individual motivation all influence communication as much as the specific words chosen. He paused, his upper eyes scanning the room before settling on the third row. Ms. Voss, perhaps you could share your thoughts on how this principle might apply to interactions with species that prioritize demonstrations of strength over verbal agreements. Alira Voss straightened slightly in her seat. Though still reserved compared to many of her classmates, she had begun participating more actively in class discussions since the invasion. In such cases, she replied, her voice clear and measured, it's important to recognize that demonstrations of strength may themselves be a form of communication, not necessarily threats, but statements of capability and resolve. Effective negotiation might require establishing respect through appropriate demonstrations before verbal diplomacy can proceed effectively. Professor Cal's exoskeleton shifted in a pattern of approval. An excellent observation. The assumption that all species value words equally has led to numerous misunderstandings throughout Federation history. As the professor continued his lecture, Alira noticed several of her classmates glancing in her direction, with expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. The events of the invasion had transformed her status within the Academy community, from the quiet, easily overlooked human to someone whose insights carried weight. She had initially found the attention uncomfortable, but had gradually adapted to it as she recognized the opportunity it presented. If her fellow students were now more receptive to perspectives from Earth and other death worlds, perhaps greater cross-cultural understanding could emerge from the crisis. When the lecture concluded, Alira gathered her materials, still preferring physical notes to neural interfaces, and prepared to leave for her next class. As she stood, she found herself approached by a small group of first-cycle students, their expressions earnest and slightly nervous. "Excuse me, Ms. Voss," began a young Taraxian, crystal facets gleaming with reflected light. "We're forming a study group focused on practical applications of diplomatic theory. Professor Cal suggested you might be willing to share some insights." Alira regarded the group thoughtfully. Before the invasion, such an invitation would have been unlikely, and she might well have declined it. Now, both the request and her response felt like natural developments in her academic journey. "Thursday evenings would work with my schedule," she said simply. The students brightened visibly, exchanging glances that conveyed surprised delight at her acceptance. They quickly confirmed details before departing. Their conversation animated as they discussed potential topics for the study group. As Alira made her way through the academy corridors toward her advanced xenobiology class, she passed the central memorial that had been installed to commemorate the invasion. A simple holographic display showed the names of all who had participated in the resistance efforts, alongside a quotation chosen by the student council. "True peace requires both understanding and readiness." The words had been excerpted from Professor Cal's report to the Federation Council, a document that had already influenced policy discussions regarding security protocols at other Federation institutions. The professor had credited Alira as the inspiration for the sentiment, though she had declined to have her name specifically associated with it. Pausing briefly before the memorial, Alira reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The Academy itself remained dedicated to its core mission of fostering interspecies understanding and cooperation, but with a new recognition that such noble goals sometimes required practical protection. As for Alira herself, she remained committed to her diplomatic studies, but with a clearer vision of how her unique background might contribute to Federation discourse. The skills she had once believed would be irrelevant in the peaceful halls of academia had proven vital when peace was threatened. Perhaps the integration of those seemingly disparate aspects of her experience represented a form of diplomacy itself, finding harmony between different approaches rather than elevating one above another. A soft chime signaled the imminent start of her next class. Alira continued on her way, moving with the same quiet confidence that had always characterized her movements. Students and faculty who passed her in the corridor acknowledged her with respectful nods or friendly greetings, a subtle but significant change from the curious glances or complete oversight she had experienced before. In the aftermath of crisis, the Deathworlder girl, who had silenced an army with calm efficiency and tactical precision, had not become a celebrated hero or a feared warrior. Instead, she had emerged as something perhaps more valuable to the Federation's future, a reminder that true strength came from integrating diverse perspectives and capabilities rather than dismissing those that seemed incompatible with preferred ideals. As she entered her xenobiology classroom, Alira took her usual seat, still in the third row, still with her paper journal ready for notes. Professor Namix nodded to her in greeting, his elongated fingers arranging holographic displays of various species' physiological systems. "Today," the professor announced to the assembled students. We begin our study of adaptive biological responses to environmental stressors. How different species evolve unique capabilities to survive in challenging conditions. His gaze met Alira's briefly, and a subtle understanding passed between them. Knowledge born of shared experience, rather than academic theory. As recent events have reminded us, Professor Namix continued, such adaptations, whether physiological or cultural, represent not just fascinating biological variations, but vital contributions to our collective resilience. Alira opened her journal and began taking notes, her expression as composed as ever. But those who knew her well might have detected the slight smile that briefly touched her lips, an acknowledgement that in a galaxy of diverse beings, every adaptation, every perspective, every voice, even those usually silent, had its moment of crucial importance. The lesson continued, and with it, the Academy's gradual evolution toward a more comprehensive understanding of what true galactic cooperation required. Not just beautiful words and noble ideals, but also the quiet, determined readiness to defend those ideals when necessary. In the peaceful lecture hall, surrounded by beings from dozens of worlds, Alira Voss, Deathworlder, diplomat, defender, found herself exactly where she belonged.